The last thing Craig did before he disappeared was make sure everyone believed I was the one who was breaking. It was a Sunday in March of 2012. Our kitchen in Westerville, Ohio, smelled like the coffee I'd made for a house full of his family. His mother, his brother, 2 neighbors. Craig stood by the counter, calm, and told them he couldn't keep living like this. That I was unstable, that he'd tried everything. He said the word tired, the way other men throw a punch. I remember holding a dish towel. I remember my daughter Emma, 9 years old, frozen on the stairs. I remember my son Danny, 11, standing a little closer to his father than to me. I didn't shout. That was my mistake, people said later. A woman who doesn't defend herself must be guilty of something. So I stood there while Craig built a version of me for an audience, brick by brick, and watched them nod. By the time he left, he'd taken more than the marriage. He'd taken the story, the idea that I was fragile, difficult, unstable. He walked out with our son and a suitcase, and he left me the debt, the house I couldn't afford, and a reputation with a crack running straight through it. I was 37. I had $11 in my checking account, and a name that now needed explaining. 14 years have passed since that Sunday. I want to tell you who I am now, but not yet, because for a long time, I didn't know either. My name is Diane Kessler. I'm 51 years old, and I've spent most of my life in kitchens. First because I had to, later because I was good at it, and finally because they became the only place the story was mine to write. Back then, I was nobody's chef. I was a woman with 2 kids, a smeared name, and a debt I didn't create. That's where we're starting. Where we end is a desk, an application, and a name I recognized.
Welcome to her silent triumph. Get comfortable. Every woman in these stories was underestimated by someone who should have known better. Hit that like button and tell me where you're watching from. Stay with me. To understand the desk, you have to understand the $11. Before Craig rewrote me, I had a small, ordinary life that I loved more than I ever told anyone. I met Craig Dalton in 1999, behind the line at Marlowe's Diner off Cleveland Avenue. I was 24, a prep cook who'd talked her way into a line spot. He came in selling restaurant equipment. Charming, quick. He liked that I could break down a case of chickens faster than the men beside me. I liked that he looked at me like I was going somewhere. Back then, I still had my first employee badge from Marlowe's. A laminated card, employee number 47. My hair pulled back in a photo where I'm not quite smiling. I kept it clipped inside my knife back like a good luck charm. It reminded me that I'd started with nothing and earned my place one plate at a time. We married in 2001. Danny came that same year, Emma in 2003. Craig moved into sales management. I stepped back from full-time line work to raise them, picking up catering shifts and holiday banquets to keep my hands in it. We bought the house in Westerville, mostly on my down payment, money I'd saved shift by shift, though the mortgage carried both our names. For a while it was good. Sunday sauce, kids underfoot, a used minivan. I taught Danny to crack eggs one-handed. Emma slept in a laundry basket by the pass while I plated a 100-guest wedding. I thought I was building something permanent. What I didn't see was how carefully Craig kept the books in his name and the blame in mine. When his number slipped, he opened a credit line for the family and had me sign for it. When he wanted a truck, he put it on our joint account. I trusted him the way you trust the floor under your feet, completely, until it isn't there.
That was the life I had. Small, mine, full of the smell of onions and the sound of two kids who still called for me in the night. I want you to see it clearly, because a man is about to take it apart, and I need you to know it was real before it was ruined. The unraveling didn't start with another woman. It started with a phone call from a bank. In the winter of 2011, a woman from a bank called to ask when we intended to bring the account current. I didn't know which account. She read me a number, $38,400 on a household line of credit, one I'd co-signed years earlier without really reading it, back when I still trusted the floor under my feet. He'd drawn it to the limit and quietly stopped paying. When I asked Craig, he didn't flinch. He said he'd handle it, the way he handled everything, which meant it would become my problem later. I found the truck loan next, then a second mortgage inquiry. My husband had been quietly building a life on my credit while telling me we were fine. There was a woman too, Renee, from his regional office. I found that out the ordinary way. A hotel charge, a tone in his voice. But honestly, the affair hurt less than the arithmetic. He'd made me the borrower of record for his choices. I confronted him in February. I was calm. I've always been calm when it counts, which people mistake for coldness. I asked him to make it right. Instead, Craig got ahead of the story. He started telling people I was not okay, that I was spending, erratic, imagining things. He told his mother I'd become impossible. He told the neighbors he was worried about me. By the time that Sunday in March came, the ground had already been prepared. When he stood in our kitchen and called me unstable, half the room had heard the setup for weeks. He asked Danny who he wanted to live with, in front of everyone, and our 11-year-old, scared, loyal, wanting his dad's approval, said Daddy. Emma clung to my leg, and Craig gathered his version of the truth and our son and walked out to a car, where I later learned Renee was waiting. The last thing he said took the longest to survive. He looked at the room, not at me, and said, "I just want her to get the help she needs." Here's the line that stopped my heart. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted them to hear it. He wasn't leaving me. He was making sure that if I ever told the truth, I'd sound exactly like the woman he described. The months after Craig left were the quietest kind of drowning. The debt was legally mine. My name was on it, in my own hand. And no court cares that you sign out of love instead of greed. A lawyer told me the cleanest way out wasn't a lawsuit I couldn't afford. It was simply to pay. So I set out to pay off $38,400 of a life I never got to spend. The house went into short sale by that autumn. Emma and I moved into a one-bedroom apartment off Morse Road, where I slept on a pull-out couch so she could have the room. Danny stayed with Craig. My son looked at me, that first year, like a boy who'd been told his mother was a storm he'd survived. Every other weekend he came over careful and polite, and each time he left, I sat on the bathroom floor so Emma wouldn't hear. People I'd cooked for, laughed with, fed at their weddings,
got quiet. A few asked if I was doing better, in that voice. Craig had spent a year teaching everyone to read me as unstable, and now every ordinary emotion I had became evidence. If I cried, I was fragile. If I didn't, I was cold. He'd built a cage out of other people's glances.
I took the only work that didn't ask for references I couldn't get. Back of house overnight prep at a commissary kitchen, then a line spot at a chain steakhouse. 14-hour days. I'd come home smelling of fryer oil and fall asleep in my clothes. One night, unpacking the last box I hadn't touched, I found my knife bag. And clipped inside, exactly where I'd left it years before, was that first employee badge from Marlowe's. Employee number 47. That girl with her hair pulled back, not quite smiling. 24 years old, and sure she'd earn her place one plate at a time. I almost threw it out. It felt like a joke the past was playing on me. Instead, I set it on the windowsill above the sink, face up, and I looked at her for a long time. She didn't know anything yet. She just knew how to show up and work. I was 38, sleeping on a couch, carrying a debt with another person's fingerprints on it, in a city that had decided who I was. That was the bottom. The badge on the windowsill was the only thing that still called me by my real name. Here's the part of the story where I disappeared. Not the way Craig meant, but on purpose. I stopped explaining myself. That was the first decision, and it changed everything. For a year, I tried to correct the record. A careful sentence here, a defense there, and every correction only made me sound like the woman he'd described. So I quit. I let people believe whatever was easiest for them, and I spent the energy I saved on my daughter and my knives. I made a rule for myself. I would not build my life as an argument against Craig. I would build it as if he'd never existed. If I spent my 40s trying to prove I wasn't unstable, I'd still be letting him hold the pen. So I put the pen down and picked up the work. The commissary manager, a blunt woman named Sal, noticed I could run a station in my sleep and never called out. She started handing me the schedule to fix, then the ordering, then the food cost spreadsheets nobody else wanted. I discovered something I'd never had room to learn. I wasn't just good on the line. I was good at the parts of a kitchen that lose money in the dark. Labor, waste, par levels, the boring math that decides whether a restaurant lives. If you've been listening for a while, do me one quick favor. Subscribe. It costs you nothing and means everything. I took every extra shift and every ugly job. I closed and I opened. I learned the vendor side, the permit side, the payroll side. Emma did her homework at a prep table with a headlamp on when the dining room lights were off. She learned fractions by scaling recipes. Some nights, I felt like a bad mother for it. Years later, she told me those were the nights she felt safest, watching me be competent at something, in a world that had spent a year telling her I couldn't be trusted. The debt came down one brutal payment at a time. I never missed one, because a missed payment was a story Craig could tell. 38,000 became 30, then 20. It took 6 years. I still have the letter that said the balance was 0. I read it the way other people read scripture. Danny drifted further those years, then slowly back. Teenagers see more than we think. Somewhere around 15, he started noticing the gap between the mother he'd been told about and the mother who showed up,
On time, every time, asking nothing. He didn't apologize. Kids don't have the words. But he started staying for dinner. He started calling me when something went wrong instead of his father. I never made him choose. I'd learned what it costs a child to be asked that question in a crowded room.
By 2016, I'd saved enough, and Sal vouched for enough to take over the lease on a failing sandwich spot in Clintonville. I called it Rowan and Rye. 22 seats. I did the cooking, the books, the hiring, the mopping. I made exactly one promise to every person I hired. I will never ask you to lie about who you are to keep this job. I knew what the opposite of that felt like. The morning we opened, I cleaned out my knife bag and found the badge again. Employee 47. That girl with her hair pulled back. This time, I didn't put her on a windowsill. I slid her into the back of the top drawer of the desk in my tiny office, under the checkbook. Not on display. Just there, where I'd see her every time I reached for the thing that paid the bills. A private reminder that I'd started with nothing and was, quietly, starting again. I told no one my whole story. Not the debt, not the kitchen full of people, not the word he'd used. My staff knew me as Diane, the owner who was fair and a little unreadable, and never, ever raised her voice. That was fine. For the first time in years, the version of me people believed was one I built myself, on purpose, plate by plate. I wasn't happy yet, but I was mine. And in the quiet, without anyone watching, I was becoming someone Craig had never met. Rowan and Rye was supposed to be enough. One room, 22 seats, a life I controlled. Instead, it became the first door in a hallway I didn't know I was building. The sandwich shop worked because I ran it like the commissary taught me. Tight labor, no waste, food people actually wanted at a price that made sense. Within a year, we were turning the 22 seats 4 times at lunch. A regular named Paul Ackerman, who owned 2 aging diners across Columbus, sat at my counter one Tuesday and said the sentence that changed my life. "You could fix mine. I'd back you if you would."
I was 44. I'd spent 6 years learning that the money in a restaurant hides in the parts nobody wants to look at. And here was a man handing me 2 broken kitchens and a checkbook. I said yes on one condition, that I ran them my way, all the way down to who we hired and how we treated them. He agreed. We opened the second Rowan and Rye in Grandview in 2018 and a third in Dublin the year after. I built the company the way I'd rebuilt myself, slowly and in the parts you can't see from the dining room. I paid $1 above market and demanded a standard to match it. And I built something most restaurant groups don't bother with, a real hiring process with a real HR function. Because I knew exactly what it costs a person to be at the mercy of one man's version of them. That's the part that matters for this story. As we grew, I stopped being the person who did the hiring. I built a system so it wouldn't depend on my mood or my memory. By 2022, we were Copperline Hospitality Group. 9 restaurants across Ohio, 400 employees. I signed off on senior roles, but every application flowed through that system, into a database, onto a desk, sometimes mine. Hold on to that, because Craig doesn't know any of it. Here's the asymmetry at the heart of everything that's coming. While he was still telling the last of his story about the unstable woman he'd had to leave, that woman had quietly become the person who decided whether 400 people worked, and under what conditions, in a company worth more than he would earn in 3 lifetimes. He thought the story was over. He didn't know I'd been writing the ending in a language he never learned to read. The quiet arithmetic of who gets hired, and on whose terms.
The money changed my life in the ordinary ways. I bought a small house in Clintonville with a real bedroom for Emma, who was in culinary school by then and rolled her eyes at everything I cooked. Danny, working construction, came to Sunday dinner most weeks. We didn't talk about the past. We just kept showing up, which is its own kind of apology and forgiveness, passed back and forth over a pot of sauce. I heard about Craig only in fragments. The sales career had peaked and slid. He and Renee had married, then struggled. There'd been a business of his own that didn't make it, a move to Cincinnati and back. I felt almost nothing when I heard. Not triumph, not grief. He'd become weather in another state. I had a company, a family stitching itself back together, and a badge in the back of a drawer that only I understood. I thought that was the whole story. Quiet, owned, complete. I was wrong. The hallway had one more door in it, and his hand was already reaching for the handle. By the spring of 2026, Copperline Hospitality Group was opening its 10th restaurant, and for the first time in 14 years, I trusted the floor under my feet. I was 51. I had a corner office I still felt faintly embarrassed by, a leadership team I trusted, and a rule I'd never broken. We hired people, not reputations. Every candidate for a management role got a structured interview, a skills assessment, and a reference check run by our VP of People, a sharp, fair woman named Grace Okafor. I'd built that wall on purpose. I knew what happened when one person got to decide who you were.
Craig's life, meanwhile, had gone the other direction. Not because I did anything, but because the version of himself he'd sold eventually ran out of buyers. The trick that once broke me had never really left him. When his numbers slipped, he blamed his reps. When a deal died, it was always someone else's signature, someone else's fault. It worked until it didn't. He was let go the year his manager stopped believing the story, then started a company that folded when the same habit chased off his partners. Renee, I heard, had left the way he once left me, quietly and with the better story. At 54, he was applying for jobs in an industry he'd only ever sold equipment to. He needed work, and he needed something else too. He needed to be seen by whoever would look as a stable man who'd landed on his feet. He needed a place respectable enough to prove Renee wrong. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew was that we'd posted a regional general manager role for the Southern Ohio expansion. A real job, 6 figures, oversight of 3 restaurants. Grace's team ran the first rounds. My part came later, at the end, when a short list reached my desk. I never wanted revenge. I wanted my life back. So I stopped waiting, and I went to work. That Tuesday, I went to work like any other. A menu tasting at 10, a lease review at noon, and after lunch, the folder Grace had left on my desk. 4 finalists for regional GM, resumes on top, the database printouts underneath. I opened it with a coffee in one hand, half my mind still on the tasting. 3rd resume down, I stopped. Craig Dalton, 54, an address in Westerville, 10 minutes from the house he'd once taken from me. A career summary polished into something that almost hid the falling. 2 references, and a cover letter about seeking a stable organization with strong values. He'd applied to my company. He wanted a job that reported 4 levels up to me.
He didn't know that. The posting carried the Copperline name, not mine. The last name I use now isn't the one I had when he knew me. To Craig, this was just a well-run company with a good reputation and an opening.
He had no idea the unstable woman he'd invented was the reason the reputation existed. He'd handed his name, his story, and his need to be forgiven straight across the desk of the person he'd spent a year erasing. I set the coffee down. For a long minute, I didn't feel powerful. I felt the room in Westerville, the dish towel, my son's small voice saying, "Daddy." 14 years, and here it was. His application on my desk. The question wasn't whether I could end him. It was what kind of woman I'd become while he wasn't looking. I gave myself one night before I touched that folder again. Because I'd learned that decisions made with your heart back in that kitchen in 2012 are rarely ones you can live with. I drove home. Emma, 23 and interning at our flagship, was at my table, eating my food and correcting my seasoning. Danny called about a truck. I looked at my 2 grown children, the ones who'd been 9 and 11 on the stairs, and I understood something I needed to understand before morning. I had already won. Not the argument, the life. Winning wasn't waiting for me on the other side of Craig's application. It was already sitting at my table, rolling its eyes at my risotto. So the question became simple and hard. What does a person who has already won do with the man who tried to make sure she never would?
I knew every wrong answer because I'd lived on the other end of them. I could reject him with a keystroke and let him wonder for the rest of his life why the good company with the good values passed him over. I could bring him all the way in, sit across from him in the final interview, and watch the exact moment he realized. I could tell Grace the whole story, the debt, the kitchen, the word unstable, and let the truth I'd swallowed for 14 years finally do some damage. Every one of those was Craig's language. Manage the story, control the room, decide who someone gets to be. If I did any of them, I'd be picking the pen back up, and I'd promised myself in a 1-bedroom apartment off Morse Road that I never would. Here's the number that settled it. The line of credit he drained in my name had been $38,400. The debt that cost me my house, my sleep, 6 years of payments I read like scripture. The job he'd applied for paid $140,000 a year, inside a company that had done $24 million in revenue the year before. I could have let those numbers make me cruel. Instead, they made me clear. I wasn't the borrower of record for his choices anymore, and I refused to become the author of his punishment either. Both were just different ways of letting him set the terms. The next morning, I did the most ordinary thing in the world. I followed the procedure I built for exactly this reason.
I opened a memo to Grace Okafor and wrote it plainly. I have a personal conflict of interest with one of the finalists for the regional GM role, Craig Dalton. Effective immediately, I am recusing myself from this hiring decision in full. Please evaluate him strictly on the same merits as every other candidate. He is to receive no advantage and no disadvantage from any history with me. I will not see his file, his scores, or the outcome until it is final. Do not disclose my involvement to the candidate. It is not relevant to his qualifications. Then I closed the folder, walked it down the hall, and set it on Grace's desk. She read the memo, looked up, and asked only one question, the fair, professional kind. Is there anything I need to know for the safety of the process? I said no.
She nodded. That was the entire conversation. That was the whole reckoning. A memo, a walk down a hallway, and a door I chose to close. I never sat across from Craig. I never got the satisfaction people think they want. I gave the decision to a system I built to be fair precisely because a system had once been so unfair to me. If he was the best candidate, he'd get the job on his merits and never know whose company he joined. If he wasn't, he'd be turned down by people who'd never heard his name before that week. Either way, for the first time in 14 years, Craig Dalton's fate had nothing to do with a story about me. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't, quite. Grace's team brought the finalists in for a panel at our headquarters that Thursday. I stayed in my office with the door shut. But our lobby has one thing on the wall that I didn't think about until later. The thing every new hire gets told about on their first day. In a simple black shadow box, under glass, is a laminated employee badge. Employee number 47. A 24-year-old woman with her hair pulled back, not quite smiling. Beside it, a small brass plate reads, "Where we started. DK, founder."
Craig sat in that lobby for 20 minutes before his interview. I know, because Grace mentioned afterward that one of the candidates had gone pale and quiet and asked the receptionist, carefully, twice, what the D stood for. He put it together the only way that would ever have reached him. Not from my mouth, not in a triumphant line, but from a girl in a photograph he'd known in 1999, staring back at him from the wall of a company he'd begged to join. He didn't ask to see me. He didn't say my name to the panel. He went through his interview, I'm told, like a man reading his own sentence off a page, and then he drove back to Westerville. I didn't smile when Grace told me. I didn't feel the thing I'd once imagined. I just felt the quiet of a room I no longer had to explain myself in. Craig didn't get the job. I know that only because months later Grace mentioned in passing that the regional GM role had gone to an internal candidate. She still doesn't know the whole story. I never told her. Some things you carry so they don't become weapons in someone else's hands. A week after the interview, a letter came to the office, addressed to me by the name he finally knew. It was short. He said he understood now whose company it was. He said he was sorry. Not the courtroom kind, the tired kind. A man too worn down to perform anymore. He said he'd spent years telling a story about me, and had somehow ended up believing the opposite of the truth. He didn't ask for the job. He didn't ask for anything. That, more than anything, told me he'd finally run out of pen. I read it once. I didn't write back. Not out of cruelty. I was simply done editing his understanding of me. What he believed about me had stopped being my job 14 years ago.
Here's the part nobody tells you about a moment like this. Winning doesn't give anything back. That's the cost, and it's real. I got my name back, but not the 14 years. Not the house in Westerville where Emma took her first steps. Not the 6 years of sleep I traded for a debt that was never mine. And not the thing that still aches on the good days. The boy on the stairs. Because Danny put it together too. He was old enough now to ask, and I finally told him. The debt, the kitchen full of people, the word his father used, the reason he'd been asked to choose at 11. My son, 25 and grown, sat at my counter and cried the way you cry for something you can't return. He said, I stood closer to him. I said, you were a child and he made you. We're okay now. But there's a small, permanent distance in him. A
guilt I couldn't cook or work or win my way out of. Craig didn't just take my years. He took a clean version of my son's childhood. And no reckoning, however calm, hands that back. I don't regret the memo. I'd write it again. But I want you to hear the honest thing. The door I closed was quiet, and it was right. And it still cost me something I'll never fully recover. These days, the badge still hangs in the lobby, and new hires still ask what the D stands for. I tell them the same thing every time, that I started with nothing. An employee number and a willingness to show up. And that the only story about you that matters is the one you build with your own hands, plate by plate. Craig tried to write me as unstable, and for a while the world read his version. What he never understood is that you can't defend your way out of a lie like that. You can only outlast it. You put the pen down, you go to work, and you let 14 years of showing up say the thing no single sentence ever could.
I didn't ruin him. I didn't need to. I just refused, in the end, to become the author of anyone's punishment, including my own. The reversal wasn't a speech or a trap. It was a woman following her own fair procedure in a company she built to be fair, because she remembered exactly what unfairness costs. If a man ever rewrote you and handed the story to a room full of people who nodded, hear me. The quietest triumph there is comes the day his need lands on the desk you built, and you get to choose the kind of woman who signs the memo. Choose the one you can live with. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.